What we're witnessing in the Persian Gulf and the Caribbean right now is not really about fuel smuggling or sanctions enforcement. It's about power, raw power. And when you strip away all the legal language, all the claims about international law, what you have is a classic case of great power competition playing out in one of the world's most strategic choke points. Let me explain what's really happening here. Iran has seized another oil tanker in the Persian Gulf. The IRGC says it's about stopping fuel smuggling. The United States has intercepted what it calls a shadow fleet tanker carrying Venezuelan oil in the Caribbean. Washington says it's enforcing sanctions. Venezuela calls it piracy. Iran calls it American lawlessness. But here's what you need to understand. Both sides are doing exactly what you would expect them to do in an anarchic international system. And by anarchic, I don't mean chaotic. I mean there's no higher authority above states that can enforce rules. No world government, no global police force with real teeth. In my view, states exist in a self-help system. They have to provide for their own security because no one else will do it for them. This creates what I call the security dilemma. When Iran takes actions to enhance its security, like controlling the Strait of Hormuz, seizing vessels it views as threatening its interests, the United States sees that as a threat. When the United States takes actions to enforce its preferences, like intercepting Venezuelan oil tankers, Iran sees that as a threat. Each side claims legality. Each side invokes international law. But international law, in the realist perspective, is largely a reflection of the distribution of power. The powerful write the rules, and they enforce them when it suits their interests. Now let's talk about geography, because geography matters enormously in international politics. The Strait of Hormuz is only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 20% of the world's oil passes through that strait. This gives Iran enormous leverage. It's what I would call a strategic choke point, a place where a relatively weaker power can impose costs on much stronger powers. Iran knows this. The United States knows this. And everyone watching knows this. When Iran seizes tankers in the Gulf, it's sending a message. We control access to this waterway. We can disrupt global energy markets if we choose to. Don't push us too far. This is classic coercive diplomacy. Iran doesn't have the conventional military power to confront the United States directly. It can't match American carrier groups or air power, but it doesn't need to. It just needs to create enough uncertainty, enough risk that it raises the costs for American action. Now, why is Venezuela part of this story? Because the United States is engaged in what it calls sanctions enforcement against Venezuela. But from Iran's perspective and from Venezuela's perspective, this looks like the United States using its overwhelming power to dictate terms to smaller states. Iran and Venezuela have become natural partners, not because they share ideology necessarily, but because they share an enemy. They're both targets of American pressure. They're both oil producers trying to sell their product despite American sanctions. This is classic balance of power behavior. When you face a powerful adversary, you look for allies, even unlikely ones. And the United States sees this partnership as threatening. Venezuela provides Iran with a foothold in Latin America in what Washington considers its sphere of influence. Iran provides Venezuela with technical support and a model of resistance to American pressure. Both sides wrap their actions in legal language. Iran talks about anti-smuggling operations. The United States talks about sanctions enforcement and international law. But let me be clear, international law is a weak constraint on state behavior, especially when core security interests are at stake. Can the United States legally seize vessels carrying Venezuelan oil on the high seas based on its own unilateral sanctions? Iran says no. The U.S. says yes. Who's right? From a realist perspective, that's the wrong question. The right question is, who has the power to enforce their interpretation? And right now, the United States has more raw power than Iran. But power isn't just about military capability. It's also about resolve, about willingness to bear costs, and about geography. Iran can't project power into the Caribbean the way the United States can. But the United States faces real constraints in the Persian Gulf. Any military action against Iran in the Strait of Hormuz would almost certainly spike oil prices, disrupt global supply chains, and potentially draw in other regional powers. These are serious costs, even for a superpower. What worries me about the current situation is that we're on an escalation ladder, and neither side has a clear off-ramp. The United States continues to pressure Venezuela and Iran through sanctions. Iran responds by seizing tankers and demonstrating its ability to disrupt shipping. The U.S. might then feel compelled to increase its naval presence in the Gulf. Iran might respond with more seizures or even attacks on infrastructure. Where does it end? In my research on great power politics, I've found that this kind of tit-for-tat escalation can be very dangerous. Each side believes it's responding proportionally. Each side believes the other started it. And each side believes it can't afford to back down without losing credibility. This is how you get unintended wars. Not because anyone wants a war, but because the logic of the security dilemma and the need to maintain credibility pushes states toward confrontation. Now, there's another player we need to discuss: China. China has been willing to purchase Venezuelan oil despite American sanctions. This is significant. It means Venezuela has an alternative market, which reduces American leverage. It also means China is effectively challenging American dominance in the Western Hemisphere. From a realist perspective, this makes perfect sense. China is a rising power. The United States is the dominant power. Rising powers always challenge the existing order. They test the limits of what the hegemon will tolerate. By supporting Venezuela and maintaining normal relations with Iran, China is doing several things at once. It's securing energy supplies for its economy. It's building relationships with states that oppose American hegemony. And it's demonstrating to other countries that there are alternatives to bowing to American pressure. This is great power competition in action. The United States wants a unipolar world where its preferences shape global outcomes. China wants a multipolar world where other great powers have their own spheres of influence. Iran and Venezuela are caught in the middle, or more accurately, they're exploiting the gap between these competing visions. The Iranian official mentioned that some European officials have expressed concern about American actions. This is interesting and potentially significant. Europe depends heavily on international trade and freedom of navigation. European states are generally uncomfortable with unilateral American action that disrupts established norms, even when they don't particularly like Iran or Venezuela. But here's the problem for Europe: it doesn't have the military power to enforce its own preferences. European countries can express concern, they can diplomatically object, but they can't fundamentally alter the behavior of the United States, Iran, or China. This reflects the reality of the current international system. We're in a transitional period. American unipolarity is declining. We're moving toward a multipolar world. But we're not there yet. This creates instability and uncertainty. So what should we expect going forward? First, I don't think either side is going to back down. The United States sees sanctions as a core tool of its foreign policy. Backing down would signal weakness and encourage other states to challenge American preferences. Iran sees resistance to American pressure as essential to its security and sovereignty. Backing down would make it vulnerable to even more pressure. Second, I expect more incidents like these tanker seizures. Both sides are probing, they're testing limits. They're trying to figure out what they can get away with and what will trigger a response they can't handle. Third, the risk of miscalculation is real. Neither side wants a full-scale war. A war between the United States and Iran would be devastating for both sides, even though the U.S. would ultimately prevail militarily. But wars often start not because anyone wants them, but because of miscalculation, because of accidents, because someone misreads the other side's red lines. If there is a flashpoint that could trigger a larger conflict, it's the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has suggested in the past that if it can't export its oil, then no one in the region will export oil. This is not an idle threat. Iran has the capability to mine the strait, to use small boat swarms, to deploy anti-ship missiles. It can't close the strait permanently. American military power would eventually reopen it, but it could close it long enough to send oil prices skyrocketing and create a global economic crisis. Would Iran actually do this? It depends on how threatened it feels. If Iran believes that the United States is trying to topple its government, if sanctions are strangling its economy to the point of domestic instability, then the costs of escalation start to look acceptable compared to the costs of doing nothing. This is the danger of pushing states into a corner. When you leave them no good options, they start choosing from among bad options. Step back for a moment and look at the broader pattern. We're seeing similar dynamics in multiple regions. In the South China Sea, China is asserting control over what it considers its maritime territory, while the United States conducts freedom of navigation operations. In the Black Sea, Russia has disrupted Ukrainian grain exports and challenged NATO naval presence. In the Persian Gulf, Iran is seizing tankers while the United States interdicts sanctions violators. What do all these situations have in common? They all involve competition over strategic waterways. They all involve challenges to American dominance. And they all involve rising or regional powers testing whether the United States will actually enforce the rules it claims to uphold. This is what the transition from unipolarity to multipolarity looks like. It's messy, it's dangerous, and it's going to continue for years, probably decades. Let me address the sanctions issue directly because it's central to this whole situation. The United States has used sanctions as a primary tool of foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, and especially since 9/11. Washington believes sanctions allow it to punish adversaries and change their behavior without resorting to military force. But here's the problem. Sanctions only work when everyone cooperates. When China is willing to buy Venezuelan oil despite sanctions, when other countries continue to trade with Iran through various workarounds, the sanctions become less effective. Moreover, aggressive use of sanctions encourages countries to develop alternatives to the U.S.-dominated financial system. We're already seeing this with China's efforts to internationalize the yuan, with Russia and Iran conducting bilateral trade in national currencies, with BRICS countries discussing alternative payment systems. In the long run, America's aggressive use of sanctions might actually undermine the dollar's role as the global reserve currency. That would be a significant erosion of American power. Here's what I want you to understand. International politics is ultimately about power, not justice, not law, not moral principles. Power. States do what they can get away with, constrained only by the power of other states and the costs of action. The United States seizes vessels because it has the naval power to do so and believes its security interests require it. Iran seizes vessels because it controls access to the Strait of Hormuz and believes its security interests require it. Both invoke law, both claim legitimacy, but neither would be doing this if they didn't have the power to do it and the motivation to use that power. This doesn't mean morality and law are irrelevant. They matter for domestic politics, for building coalitions, for maintaining legitimacy, but they don't fundamentally change the logic of great power competition. I've been arguing for years that we're heading toward increased great power competition, and this situation in the Gulf is one manifestation of that trend. The United States wants to maintain its position as the dominant global power. China wants to become the dominant power in Asia and a major player globally. Russia wants to restore its great power status. Regional powers like Iran want greater autonomy and influence in their neighborhoods. These goals are fundamentally incompatible. They can't all be achieved simultaneously. This means conflict, not necessarily military conflict, though that's always possible, but certainly economic, diplomatic, and geopolitical conflict. The tanker seizures we're seeing are skirmishes in this larger competition. They're relatively low-cost ways for Iran to push back against American pressure, to demonstrate resolve, to impose costs, and to signal that it won't be pushed around. Now, if you're asking me what the United States should do, and I know this will be controversial, I think Washington needs to be realistic about what it can achieve with sanctions and pressure. The goal of collapsing the Iranian or Venezuelan governments through economic pressure has not worked. These regimes have proven more resilient than many expected. Continuing to escalate pressure increases the risk of conflict without necessarily achieving the desired political change. From a strategic perspective, the United States needs to ask itself, what are our vital interests in the Persian Gulf? Is regime change in Iran a vital interest, or is the vital interest preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons and maintaining freedom of navigation for energy supplies? If it's the latter, then there might be room for a modus vivendi, an understanding where neither side gets everything it wants, but both sides avoid catastrophic conflict. Iran maintains its regime and has some sanctions relief. The United States maintains naval access, and Iran doesn't pursue nuclear weapons. I'm not saying this will happen. Both sides have reasons to prefer the current confrontation, but from a purely strategic standpoint, unending escalation serves neither side's long-term interests. But here's the deeper problem. Even if leaders on both sides wanted to de-escalate, the structure of the international system pushes them toward competition. Iran looks at what happened to Libya when Gaddafi gave up his weapons programs. He was overthrown with Western support. Iran looks at what happened to Ukraine when it gave up its nuclear weapons. It was invaded by Russia. The lesson Iran draws is never give up your deterrent capability. Never trust security guarantees from great powers. Always maintain the ability to impose costs on your adversaries. The United States looks at Iranian support for Hezbollah, for the Houthis, for various militias in Iraq and Syria. Washington sees an expansionist power trying to dominate the Middle East and threaten American allies. The lesson the U.S. draws is maintain pressure, maintain sanctions, maintain military presence, don't give an inch. Both sides are acting rationally given their threat perceptions, but their rational actions create a dangerous spiral. Let's talk about the global implications. Every time there's an incident in the Strait of Hormuz, oil markets react, insurance premiums for tankers increase, shipping companies reroute vessels, energy prices rise. This affects everyone. European industries that depend on affordable energy, Asian economies that import vast quantities of oil, developing countries that are already struggling with high energy costs. In a sense, the world is being held hostage to this confrontation between the United States and Iran, with Venezuela caught in the middle. This is why other countries are frustrated. They have no real say in this dispute, but they bear the costs. European countries can't tell the United States to ease sanctions on Iran. Asian countries can't tell Iran to stop seizing tankers, but they all suffer the consequences. This is one of the problems with hegemony. The hegemon makes rules that serve its interests, and everyone else has to live with them, whether they like it or not. Both the United States and Iran are now caught in what I would call a credibility trap. The United States has said publicly that it will enforce sanctions on Iran and Venezuela. If it backs down now, if it allows tankers to violate sanctions without consequence, other states will conclude that American threats are empty. This would encourage more sanctions violations, more challenges to American preferences. Iran has said publicly that it will respond to American pressure, that it will defend its interests, that it won't be dictated to by Washington. If it backs down now, if it stops seizing tankers or reduces its support for regional allies, hardliners in Tehran will see this as capitulation. It would also encourage more American pressure. So both sides have locked themselves into positions that are difficult to retreat from without losing face. This is dangerous because it reduces flexibility and increases the risk that a relatively minor incident could spiral into a major confrontation. We also need to consider domestic politics on both sides. In the United States, there's broad bipartisan support for being tough on Iran. Any administration that appears to be soft on Iran risks domestic political backlash. This constrains American policy options. In Iran, hardliners have gained influence, especially after the collapse of the nuclear deal. Moderates who argued for engagement with the West have been discredited. This also constrains Iranian policy options. Domestic politics on both sides push toward confrontation rather than compromise. Leaders who might personally prefer de-escalation face domestic audiences that reward toughness and punish perceived weakness. Ultimately, this situation comes down to a test of resolve. Who's willing to bear more costs? Who's willing to risk more? Who blinks first? Iran has some advantages here. It's fighting close to home. The Persian Gulf is in its neighborhood. It has been under sanctions for decades and has developed coping mechanisms. Its regime's survival depends on resisting American pressure. The United States also has advantages. It has far greater military and economic power. It can sustain a long-term competition more easily. It has allies in the region who support pressure on Iran. But the United States has a disadvantage. It's fighting far from home, and the American public has limited appetite for another Middle Eastern conflict. If the confrontation with Iran threatens to become a major war, domestic opposition would grow quickly. Iran knows this. It's betting that it can outlast American resolve, that eventually Washington will decide the costs aren't worth it and will reduce pressure. The United States is betting that continued pressure will eventually force Iran to make concessions or will lead to internal collapse of the regime. Someone's going to be wrong. Let me end with the bigger picture, because this tanker incident is really just one data point in a much larger trend. The post-Cold War era of American unipolarity is ending. Not tomorrow, not next year, but it's ending. China's rise, Russia's resurgence, the diffusion of technology and weapons capabilities, all of this is eroding American dominance. We're entering a world where multiple great powers compete for influence, where regional powers have more autonomy, where American preferences don't automatically become global rules. This transition is going to be turbulent. We're going to see more incidents like these tanker seizures, more challenges to American power, more tests of whether the United States will actually enforce the rules it claims to uphold. The tragedy is that this could potentially lead to major power war. I've written extensively about this risk. When a rising power challenges an established power, when hegemonic transition occurs, history shows us that war is more likely than not. I'm not predicting war between the United States and China or between the United States and Iran, but I'm saying the structural conditions that lead to great power war are present. We need to be aware of this risk and work actively to manage it. So what's my bottom line on this tanker situation? It's not really about tankers. It's not really about fuel smuggling or sanctions enforcement. It's about power, influence, and the struggle to shape the international order. Iran is using its geographic position and asymmetric capabilities to push back against American pressure. The United States is using its military and economic power to enforce its preferences globally. Venezuela is caught in the middle, but also exploiting the situation to its advantage. China is quietly supporting alternatives to American dominance. This will continue. It will probably get worse before it gets better, and the rest of the world will have to navigate the turbulence created by great power competition. The optimistic scenario is that both sides learn to manage this competition, to keep it below the threshold of major war, to find modus vivendi on the most dangerous issues. The pessimistic scenario is that miscalculation, accidents, or domestic political pressure push one side or both toward escalation that neither can easily back away from. Which scenario we get depends partly on the wisdom of leaders in Washington, Tehran, Caracas, Beijing, and other capitals, but it also depends on the structural forces of international politics, forces that are often stronger than individual leaders. That's the reality of great power politics. It's not pretty, it's not morally satisfying, but it's how the world actually works. And right now, in the Persian Gulf and the Caribbean, we're watching it play out in real time, one seized tanker at a time.